I guess before we dive specifically into the books, that's sort of the early stuff. Is there any more formative stuff along the way?
Well, let me think about it. I think environment. I grew up, when I was 3, my folks bought a little cottage on the Chesapeake at a time when real estate out on the western shore of the Chesapeake could be gotten for almost nothing. And we spent summers out there. And so in the winter and autumn, I was a city kid, going to the Smithsonian, riding buses across town and all of that. But in the summer, I was very much, shoes went off as soon as school was out. And I was the slow swimmer in my family. I was swimming on my own at 6. My siblings all were swimming on their own earlier because the bay was literally in our front yard. So my parents were pretty determined that if we fell in, we were not going, we needed to know how to swim.
Right.
We had a little rowboat, and again, we felt as if we had absolute freedom to go anywhere. I'm sure actually my mom was able to track us much more than we were aware of, but there was this feeling that as far as we could row in the rowboat, we could go. A neighbor who just recently died had several tracts of undeveloped land, and he told us as long as we didn't damage anything, no breaking saplings off or whatever, we had free run of his woods. That had a big impact on me, both in my interest in writing about wild things, which I do a lot of, but also in the sense of belonging to 2 different worlds at the same time. In college, I would read D.H. Lawrence's poem, Red Herring, where he talks about, in a much darker context, the fact that his father was a coal miner and his mother was an educated woman with a school teacher's background, and how he felt divided between those 2 worlds. And while I didn't have the negativity that's in his poem, I really identified with the feeling in that poem of you can be multiple people all at the same time, and it's not a contradiction. You can be a city kid and a barefoot country kid in the same package. And that had a big influence on my writing. So.
Interesting. Okay. So, why spec-fic?
Because that's how my brain works. You were at Bubonicon this year. I don't know if you got to go to any of Tim Powers' talks.
I'm afraid I didn't.
Oh. Well, Tim Powers is one of my favorite authors because Tim Powers can take normal historical events, find all the odd things that happen, and string them together so that you end up believing his alternate version of reality. While I don't do it to the same drastic extent that he does, that's how my brain works. I'm most fascinated by how things might work in an odd context. I can't write straight to save my life. I've tried. But even when I try, something at the very least sort of magical realistic creeps in. So it's just the way my brain works, and I'm pretty happy with it, and I can make a living doing it, which is nice. But I think even if suddenly the market for science fiction and fantasy dried up and the only thing you could sell was romance novels, I'm afraid I'd be tremendously out of luck because I can't write straight. My brain sees everything sideways and is very happy that way.
And so the first novel you published, let's see, I've got your bibliography here, with this
Wow.
rather large.
Yeah, this one here, which I wrote with my buddy David Weber, Tree Cat Wars, is 23.
23 novels.
23 novels and over 60 short stories.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a bunch of short stories too.
Yeah, and a sheaf of academic fiction.
And, okay, so the first one, which, Brother to Dragons, Companion to Owls.
Yes.
Now, is that the first thing you published, period? Did you publish any short stuff before
I had a
that?
couple of short stories first. Let me see. My first published short story was called Cheesecake in a short-lived magazine called Star Shores. I still have a Xerox of that check. $58. I was so excited. And to segue back to Roger Zelazny, we were corresponding at that point. I wrote him just mad with excitement because I had finally sold something, because boy, had I had a lot of rejections. And in return mail came a tax planner with a little note clipped to the front of it saying, "You're a pro now, lady. Keep track of your expenses."
So he did teach you some valuable stuff.
Oh, no kidding. It was great. Then after that, there was a long gap, and I published a story called Between Tomatoes and Snapdragons in an anthology called Dragon Fantastic, edited by Martin Greenberg. And then I think there was like a almost 2-year gap. They don't show up in publication dates, you know. The gap sometimes between when things are published and when they're sold can be huge.
Mm-hmm.
Was a story called Good Boy in Journeys to the Twilight Zone. And I think that was my sheaf of publications about the time I sold my first novel, but it didn't come out anywhere near right away. I sold Brother to Dragon's Companion Dolls, and Avon sat on it, and I sold them 2 more, Marks of Our Brothers, unconnected, despite the word brother, and Pipes of Orpheus. And then I think, what was the 4th one? Smoke and Mirrors, maybe? Before Brother to Dragon's Companion Dolls came out. They just kept accumulating them. So, yes, I had a track record, but it was sort of odd because I can't exactly remember how much I had sold in the short fiction market before that first novel came out, because it took so long for that first novel to come out, even though it was sold.
So that one, that's one of the ones I have read.
Oh, good.
And I enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm.
And that shows a little bit of your lit background.
Yeah.
Do you want to explain the conceit of the
My
protagonist?
main character, Sarah, can only speak in quotations. And they have to be quotations she's heard in a emotionally charged context. So it's not just random bits of conversation heard on a bus or something like that. And yeah, so it was a lot of fun digging through Bartlett's familiar quotations. And I can't remember the name of it. There was another book of quotations I had to get things that would fit the right context. And then hone it down because, well, even if there was a perfect quote from a speech by Winston Churchill, the likelihood Sarah would have heard that was pretty minimal. Whereas one of the other characters who she meets in the mental institution is a retired professor of English who's had a nervous breakdown. And Professor Isabella is frequently quoting from literature, so Sarah has learned to parrot a lot of what Professor Isabella says. Yeah. But talk about, not being able to write straight.
I thought it was a lot of fun. I admit when I started, I thought, okay, this is cute, but by the end of the book, this could get old. But I really enjoyed that. That was a really interesting characterization.
I worked really hard to make it natural and not a clever puzzle for the reader to figure out. And also to have times where Sarah just had to flounder because she couldn't find any way to say what she needed to say. Probably one of my favorite elements in that book is the 2-headed rubber dragon, because that's the other part of Sarah that was fun to do. Is she's essentially able to hear what inanimate objects say. And the 2-headed rubber dragon she carries around with her everywhere that has its own running commentary on the action and can in fact talk far better than Sarah can.
Right.
Was a lot of fun. And actually based on a rubber dragon I still have in my office at home. Looks down smiling at me.
So that's a science fiction novel.
Mm-hmm. Though they put fantasy on the spine because it had the word dragon in it.
Did they?
Yes.
They marked it as a fantasy book. Well, okay.
I kind of think a book with hackers and stuff is probably science fiction.
Yeah, it's very clearly science fiction. Well, that's interesting because what I was going to ask about is I've heard some people say you almost maybe have to be careful what the first thing you get published is.
Yes.
Because if you publish a science fiction novel, then that's what they expect the next book to be.
Yes, very true. And Oh, something I have to admit I find very uncomfortable, because the whole reason I like speculative fiction is I can explore any number of ideas. I mean, the story we did together, Hamlet Revisited, I don't know what the heck you'd call it. I suppose since it's a ghost, it has to be called fantasy, but it's also riffing off a literary piece.
Yeah, sometimes I feel like ghost story is almost its own kind of
It
genre.
should be.
Almost.
Yeah, because there are a lot of people who would never say they believe in magic, but believe in ghosts. The supernatural really is its own element. So it is something that makes me a little uncomfortable. I'm already writing in a genre that is supposed to entertain the innovative idea, and yet the potential of getting locked down is there. I think it might be said that what your first big hit is what might lock you down.
That makes sense.
Brother to Dragons, Companion to Owls, and Marks of Our Brothers were separate, both science fiction. And then The Pipes of Orpheus, which was my third, was a mythological fantasy. And they all did well, got really good reviews, and Locus listed and things like that. I have very fond memories of Brother to Dragons, Companion to Owls came out right around Christmas time in 1994. And by then I was in New Mexico living with Roger Zelazny. And one morning as I'm getting out of the shower, Christmas Eve, the phone rings. And it's George R.R. Martin. That's right, we have to add that. It's George R.R. Martin calling up to say that his locusts had arrived because he paid for first class delivery. And Roger and I only got ours, parcel post. And there was like a full column review of my first novel. And George read me the review over the phone as I stood in the hallway wrapped in a towel, dripping happily. And, despite really good reception, it wasn't a hit. It did well. It certainly didn't hurt me. The book that was my first hit was Through Wolf's Eyes.
Okay.
I had solid reception up to then, but Through Wolf's Eyes was the one that suddenly started getting reprints. It got picked by Tor to be part of a limited promotion of books that were going to be in the grocery store. Oh. And I was told that that was the book that the sales rep in the field were calling in and saying, no, we don't need more of the Anne McCaffrey, we need more Lindskold. Which was a pretty damn fantastic thing to hear.
Right.
Now, of course, the McCaffrey was a reprint. We'll be fair to the lady who did so much for the field. But that was the book that I think has come closest to being a little bit of a shackle on my ankles. That was the one that, up till that point, I'd been going back and forth between fantasy and science fiction pretty fluidly, whatever I felt like, and found myself now having an expectation that books would be fantasy. But my great good fortune was that the editor I was working with at that time, Teresa Nielsen Hayden at Tor, had a very broad definition of what she would accept as a book in that category. So I wrote for her Child of a Rainless Year and The Buried Pyramid, which is a historical fantasy as well. So I never felt that Teresa was keeping me pinned down, and I was very, very sorry that when, for health reasons, she retired, because I learned a lot from her and we had really good chemistry. I like writing science fiction as well, and that's one reason why when my friend David Weber approached me to do some novels set in his honor verse, I was eager to do it, because if somebody with an academic mindset wanted to sit and look at my bibliography, they would see that even as most of my novels coming out were fantasy, in short fiction, wherever possible, I was writing science fiction as well. The Berserker story that you'll be bringing out with Fred Saberhagen, you don't get much more science fiction than giant robots flying through the sky. I wrote 3 novellas for Weber set in his honor verse, because I like spaceships and
Uh-huh.
exploding rockets and all of that, just as much as I like Intelligent Wolves and all the rest. And now I seem to have come full circle. The project that's coming out in May from Tor is one that technically, print on the spine, is going to have to be science fiction because it has terraformed planets and genetically engineered animals. But I'm having fun because I'm taking a lot of the motifs that often belong to fantasy and transporting them into a science fiction context.
Yeah. What people read as science fiction and fantasy a lot of times seems to almost have more to do almost as a stylistic thing than whether there's robots or not.
Yeah. I think stylistic can be part of it. Hard science fiction can be very dry and technical, almost like you're reading a technical description that just happens to have characters. And some fantasy can verge on South American magical realism, where absolutely nothing makes sense whatsoever, and it's almost like reading a gigantic prose poem. And the majority falls somewhere in the middle. One of the projects I've worked on these last about 2.5 years now is an adjunct to my blog. My blog is called The Wednesday Wanderings, but it has a second part, The Thursday Tangent, that's just run off the same site, that I've been doing with my friend Alan Robson of New Zealand. And Alan and I did an enormous series where we started with, all right, what's science fiction, what's fantasy, what's horror?
I haven't read that.
Oh,
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's available as a free download from Alan's website, which I can't remember the URL off the cuff, but it would be easy enough to find. But we started just at the beginning with base definitions, and both of us agreeing that there really shouldn't be clearly marked differences between, but me holding forth that as a writer, it helps to know the definitions. Because if you're going to work in the field, it doesn't matter if on the literary academic side, let's say there's no difference. And in fact, I moderated a panel at Bubonicon where my 4 panelists, that was the position they all took and supported very nicely. But I'm sorry, if you're going to be trying to work in the field and sell something, you need to know the difference between sword and sorcery and high fantasy and contemporary fantasy and urban fantasy and whatever. So what Alan and I did was we had an absolutely lovely time for several months wandering through every single damn subset of science fiction and fantasy. Gosh, it must have taken more than a couple of months, because we did every subset we could find of science fiction and fantasy. Hard science fiction, soft science fiction, space opera, what's the difference between space opera and military science fiction, etc. And it gave us an excuse to also recommend all the books that we loved in those areas.
Sure.
So
that sounds fascinating. We'll have to link to that.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. And it was, but it, again, it's one of those things that's the difference between my English professor side and my professional writer side. My English professor side wholly agrees with Alan and my panelists from Bubonicon that really the divisions are only marketing divisions. The professional writer side says, if you're going to try and make a living at this, learn your definitions so that if you want to submit a story, you don't send your wonderful, absolutely beautiful story about unicorns to, I'm blanking on it, the hardest science fiction magazine out there. Analog, you know, but a lot of people will. They'll just start at the top of the list, A is for analog, followed by Asimov's, and they won't be aware that each of these are catering to slightly different subsets. So,
well, if you're trying to make a living at it, marketing categories
are important.
Yeah.
And that's why doing this story with you was fun, because I will admit with great honesty that it had any number of rejections, and it was because it didn't fall into any category very well. But I still thought it was a pretty darn good story.
I enjoyed it. It's funny.
It is funny. Hamlet is terribly funny.
Well, let's talk about that one first.
Yeah.
So the title is Hamlet Revisited. I'm not sure if
Yeah.
folks can make it out from there.
Yeah, that one came up when I was teaching English. Because if you're an English professor and you teach Introduction to English Literature, you will do Hamlet. And you will do Hamlet every term. And you will do Hamlet sometimes more than every term. And you do something, even a wonderful play like Hamlet, enough times. And at least if your brain works like mine, one day you sit down and you start to summarize the action and you realize it's actually utterly hilarious. It's, if you look at it from the point of view of the poor ghost, who has walked up to his son and said, "Excuse me, I was murdered by this person at this time in this manner, please get revenge." And then you stand back and you watch as your son methodically slaughters his way through the entire royal court of Denmark, because he can't get his head around the fact that he has been given chapter and verse of exactly what to do. So I decided to write the story, and I had a wonderful time. And I personally think it's a great illustration of the difference between comedy and tragedy is sometimes just your point of view, and that the same event, when looked upon from another side, shifts it entirely. So I think it belongs in every introductory to literature classroom in the country.
I agree.
Or the world, because because it really is a good illustration that comedy and tragedy, there's a reason the Greeks made them two masks side by side, because they understood that they're not widely separated. The difference is in how you interpret it. So.
It illustrates that very well. It does, and it's fun. It's just fun.
Yeah, well, and as a test, I gave it to my husband to read, who cannot remember if he's ever seen Hamlet, ever read Hamlet, and if he did, it was 50 years ago, or, well, give him credit, maybe 45 years ago. And he could follow it just fine. And one of those influences of Roger Zelazny on me. Roger was really praised as a very literary science fiction writer at the same time that he wrote really good adventures. And he would make references, what literary professors like to call allusions, to literary works or whatever. But he held very strongly that the story should stand on its own, whether or not you got a single allusion. And if it didn't, if it forced somebody to go and get the footnotes or whatever, then as far as he was concerned, it was a failure as a story. And that was on my mind when I wrote Hamlet Revisited. I wanted it to be a story that somebody who had no familiarity with the play, or maybe had this vague idea of somebody intoning to be or not to be, that was their limit, could still read it and enjoy it.
And you can pick that up at SnackReads.com.
And we hope you will,
Yes.
because we had fun. We want to share the game.
So you said you had your fantasy hit and your editor was pretty open, but did you write less science fiction than you would have if it had just been whatever you wanted to do?
Possibly so. The part of it is time. The Firekeeper series went to 6 volumes, none of which were thin.
Uh-huh. And that was something I was going to bring up too. You wrote a bunch of standalone.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Was that the first series, or?
Sort of. That was the first deliberate series. My first book that accidentally spawned a sequel was this one. This is my reprint of it, Changer. The original was a mass market paperback with a very lovely cover that told you absolutely nothing about it. Beautiful sand colored with abstract designs on it that might have been a Pueblo village. People, I'd do signings and people would pick it up and say, "Oh, I love Tony Hillerman." I love Tony Hillerman too, but you're not going to find him in there. So when I reissued it, I decided that let's make it clear. We've got at least one kick-ass coyote in this book. Changer is a mythological fantasy. At the time it was written, it was a contemporary fantasy, though certain key elements in the plot, like the car crash that happens at the intersection of I-40 and I-25, it would no longer work because they have rebuilt the intersection. I like to think my book, which points out what an utterly stupid intersection that is, had something to do with it. But Changer is essentially the story of mythological immortals living among us and going about their business, and what happens when the Changer, who is perhaps the oldest of them all, though no one's quite sure, decides to get revenge when his coyote family is killed. He's living as a coyote at that time, and his coyote family gets killed except for the runt of the litter who had hidden in the back of the burrow. And he decides it was probably deliberate, not just ranchers killing coyotes, from various things that he picks up early on, and he goes after them. Now, King Arthur happens to live in Albuquerque.
Oh.
Off Rio Grande Boulevard, though I don't say so specifically. Jim and I had a great deal of fun deciding just where
Exactly
along.
where.
Yeah. And King Arthur lives in Albuquerque, and so the Changer, who'd been living essentially up in the mountains near Mount Air, changes himself into a human form, steals clothes off somebody's clothesline, comes stalking in and says, "Hi, I'm here to call in my favors. I'm going to kill someone and you're going to help me find them." Doesn't quite work out that way, but that's where the kickoff point is. And to complicate matters, every 5 years, which my editor thought was too frequent for Immortals, but I didn't. The Immortals hold a conference, essentially, where they can get together and visit with friends and discuss business. I hold with what Neil Gaiman said in Sandman. I don't know if you're familiar with this Sandman, but it's brilliant. But in Sandman, at the beginning, the Sandman has been held imprisoned. And when he finally gets out of the prison, I can't quote it exactly, but basically the forces, the sorcerers who have kept him imprisoned are protesting, "But come on, you're immortal, He says, "Yes, but I still live every day like everyone else." And that was my feeling about the 5-year reviews for the Athenor, as I called my Immortals, that they're still living every day, and 5 years to get together and review community business is hardly too soon, and might even be not soon enough. But the Changer's vendetta happens to overlap the upcoming Lustrum review. So poor Arthur is pulled in a lot of directions because he essentially has immortals from all over the world coming in to have a convention in Albuquerque. They stay at the Crown Plaza Hotel. Well, it was the Crown Plaza Pyramid at that time. It's now the Marriott. I had a lot of fun, and the book did really, really well. It was the first one of my books to get reprinted, sort of to the shock of Avon Books, which had, by that time, Roger had died, and my first editor there had left, and I was, detritus, I think. I don't mean it in any hard way. It's a business.
Uh-huh.
And then Changer did very well. And we had another book on the contract, and they asked for a sequel. And then they did, I can't imagine it was deliberate, because that would have been really stupid on their part, but my original title for it was Changer's Daughter. Some anonymous person in marketing decided that the title, they didn't like that title. And my then editor and I literally went through, this is kind of, email was just on the verge, so we were spending a lot of time on the phone going down lists of possible titles.
Okay.
And we finally came up with Legends Walking, which the corporate people, anonymous, agreed to. Now, I never really liked that title. I always, in my brain, was thinking, and then the sequel will be Legends Hopping, Legends Crawling, Legends Jumping Up and Down. So when I brought them out myself as ebooks and print on demand, I gave it back its original title. And very, carefully made sure it was stated so that no one would pick it up thinking it was a third book in the series. So I sort of committed accidental series there. The Firekeeper books were my first planned thing, and very much a commercial consideration. At that point, my then editor at Avon, at the point I was coming up with the idea, my then editor at Avon was still around. He was also one of my favorites and influential, John Douglas. And I said to John, if you were buying, what would you be looking for? And he said, honestly, series. The critics love standalones, everybody else loves series. So Jim, my husband, and I spent a lot of time coming up with ideas for series that I didn't think would bore me out of my mind. And ultimately refined it down to the idea of a feral woman raised by wolves. But as much as I love the motif, and I do, The Jungle Book is one of my all-time favorite books, and Tarzan comes in really close. I felt that both Kipling and Burroughs had done just fine with what you might call the first encounter story. So I felt the story needed more meat to it than just, oh my, these are humans, which is what is so often the case. So I worked backwards. How did my then 15-year-old character end up in a position to be raised by wolves? And again, the interesting group dynamics, politics, etc. spilled in, so that although it's a story about a woman raised by wolves, it's also a story about succession politics to a contested throne. And I worked out, an elaborate family tree of all the different people who had a claim to the throne of the elderly king. And probably the thing that offended me most was a statement made to me at a book signing by a fellow who was there with his girlfriend who liked my books. And he was obviously just too cool for school. And he was going to show his general contempt. And so his girlfriend is saying, well, what is it about? And I gave a thumbnail sketch, and he said, and of course she turns out to be the missing princess. And I said, it's one of my books. Give it a try. It may surprise you. And that's me. In fact, if you've read the Firekeeper books, you know that the answer is far more complicated than just, here's our missing princess, and by the end of the book, she will be neatly ensconced as the heir to the throne. Nothing I do ever works out that simply.